The Australian economy is booming, but falling wages and skills shortages are set to put the brakes on over the next year. If you thought airfares are getting more expensive, you're right. The cheapest airfares are up more than 50% over the past 4 months. And why quiet quitting is now a feature of workforces. It's Thursday, the 8th of September 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Adam Lang, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Adam. Filling in for the difference himself from Michael Thompson, who's off in Fiji.
Big shoes to fill, Sean.
Well, he would say that.
He would, modest as he is, and I'm appropriately nervous.
Oh, Adam, you've done this hundreds of times before. Don't be silly.
I am but a novice. Sean, to kick us off, can I say hello to a regular listener this morning?
Sure.
Paul Nicolau from Business Sydney. Yesterday, he invited me and 110 other business representatives to a Zoom meeting with Australia's ambassador to the USA, Arthur Sinodinos AO. It was actually really impressive. He's impressive, and it was great to get his perspective from Washington and have his encouragement to Australian businesses amongst all this geopolitical tension to seek the opportunities and have a go.
Yeah, and Paul Nicolau is a man who likes to have a go. Good man, Paul, as you say, and he's very entrepreneurial, really. And Arthur Sinodinos, of course, worked for John Howard for many years, a politician himself, very, very impressive individuals. I'd also like to give a shout out. Then if you're giving a shout out, I'm going to give a shout out to AJ.
Hello, AJ.
AJ, a good man. He's given us a 5-star review. I dropped my car off for a service yesterday and I picked it up. And AJ served me. And he said, "Are you Sean Aylmer?" And I said, "I am." And he said, "I listen to you every morning." And well, it was quite a thrill for me.
That is brilliant.
That AJ recognised it. Yeah, it was great. And fantastic service at Toyota Pennant Hills. A shout out to Toyota Pennant Hills, but particularly to AJ. So I hope you're listening this morning, AJ.
All right. Immediately after the show, stay listening for Sean's chat with Joe Masters, Chief Economist at Barrenjoey.
Yes, we had a great chat about yesterday's economic growth figures, interest rates, and what's going to happen next. Well worth a listen.
That I will. So the main story this morning, Sean, the Australian economy expanded by a robust 0.9% during the June quarter, and that's 3.6% over the past year, clearly helped by an easing of COVID restrictions.
It was a pretty strong result, helped by people eating out more, travelling locally and overseas, and record commodity prices. While interest rates are rising and there's plenty of concerns over the rising cost of living, the Bureau of Statistics figures released yesterday show that the economy was in very, very good health during the June quarter. It was the third consecutive quarter of economic growth following a contraction in September last year, thanks to the Delta COVID variant outbreak. A few interesting facts from the data, Adam. The household savings rate continues to drop, suggesting people are prepared to spend what they built up during the pandemic. Output per hour worked, otherwise known as labour productivity, grew by 2.1% last financial year. That's the highest in a decade. Pretty good. Now, Treasurer Jim Chalmers, well, he wasn't exactly upbeat. He said the GDP figures show an economy rebounding from the COVID-19 pandemic disruptions, but held back by capacity constraints, declining real wages, and skills shortages. I think that's pretty accurate.
Sean, labour productivity going up, that's actually great to see.
It is great to see over the full year, that was. Yeah, definitely, because labour productivity has been, or productivity generally has been a real laggard in the Australian economy for a long time.
Yeah, and it's not like we've had an easy year, so well done. Now, amongst all of the stories in there, where do you think growth is the strongest?
Well, I mentioned some segments of the economy, household spending and exports. The biggest increases in household spendings were at cafes, restaurants and transport and postal services. So they all would have done pretty well. People also bought more clothing and footwear, but they spent less on grocery items. In terms of states, New South Wales really is the standout, growing by nearly 2% during the June quarter. Victoria and Queensland both grew by more than 1%.
Sean, we know there's capacity constraints, there's cost of living pressure, there is supply chain issues. Will this pace of growth continue?
In short, no. In fact, the Reserve Bank expects the economy to expand by between 2 and 2.5% this financial year. We have higher interest rates kicking in, and that will slow household spending. So too will inflation. Spending more on groceries doesn't leave as much for discretionary spending. Commodity prices, with a few notable exceptions like coal and gas, have certainly come off, and that will slow net exports. Falling house prices certainly won't help growth, nor will a tough federal budget later in the year. And in some sectors, notably construction, labour shortages, material costs and bad weather are already weighing on economic activity. That's likely to spread to other sectors. So, Adam, where does that leave us? Well, this week we've had a 50 basis point hike in the official cash rate, a strong economic growth number. Lots of warnings, though, that probably things will slow from here on in. Attention very much will now turn to a speech by Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe today to see what he makes of it all. A lot of uncertainty. I think that's probably the buzzword for the day, uncertainty.
I totally agree, Sean, and I'll be tuning in to Governor Philip Lowe today to hear it. How did the local markets respond to the news?
Well, equities didn't do much after the announcement, mostly because they'd done plenty beforehand. In morning trading, the S&P ASX 200 fell hard. In fact, it closed down 1.4% yesterday to 6,729 points. That drop really occurred in the first couple of hours of trading. It's the lowest close since July. There was red ink everywhere. Woodside Energy, Macquarie Group, National Australia Bank all closed down more than 3%. BHP, Westpac, Commonwealth Bank, Fortescue and South32 all dropped more than 2%. That's a lot of big companies with some fairly significant share price falls. Underlying the negative sentiment are fears of a global economic slowdown. Now, that was highlighted by the performance of some of the more defensive companies like Telstra, Coal, some of the healthcare stocks and some of the tech companies as well. They all outperformed. Gold digger Chalice Mining fell back 13%, while Viva Energy dropped 6.6%. They were among the worst on the day. The best of the top 200 was healthcare group ResMed, up 4.4%. Now, ResMed has had a really good rally the past couple of sessions.
Really interesting, Sean. And how about the international markets? How are they reacting?
Well, the US dollar continues to appreciate against other currencies, including the Aussie. Basically, investors like the greenback in times of uncertainty, and we are living in uncertain times. The Aussie dollar is trading lower around that 67 US cent mark. Gold, which sometimes is considered a hedge against inflation, is also losing friends. An ounce fell back below $1,700 yesterday. Oil prices hit their lowest level since January on concern that a global slowdown will cut demand in Europe and the US. Also, the rising US dollar makes oil more expensive for outside buyers. That also weighs on the price of crude. Brent crude fell back to around $91 a barrel yesterday. That's good news, of course, at the Bowser. And finally, digital currencies aren't enjoying all this volatility either, with Bitcoin falling back below $19,000 a unit yesterday.
All right, Sean, thank you. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, legislation was introduced into Parliament yesterday to make medicines in the pharmaceutical benefits scheme cheaper from next year.
That's right. The government claims 3.6 million people will benefit from January 1. The maximum price of medicines will be cut by nearly a third, from $42.50 to $30 a prescription. That's a saving of up to $300 a year for a family filling 2 scripts a month. Another piece of legislation introduced yesterday, Adam, will allow pensioners who are selling their homes to have the proceeds exempt from the Social Security asset test for 2 years. This is a big deal for pensioners. If passed, the legislation will extend the current exemption by another 12 months. It aims really to encourage pensioners to downsize.
Sean, China's ambassador to Australia said he's been working with the Foreign Affairs Department on a high-level meeting between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Chinese President Xi Jinping.
It certainly would be welcome given the deteriorating relations between the two countries. Mr. Albanese yesterday said he'd welcome one-on-one talks if they eventuate. It's most likely to happen on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Indonesia in November. Now, the change of government here has relieved some of the tension between the two countries, but there's still plenty of angst over everything from trade barriers to China's influence in the region to Beijing's engagement with Taiwan.
Sean, staying in diplomatic affairs, Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare will visit Australia next month in something of a breakthrough with our Pacific Island neighbour.
The Solomon Islands Prime Minister earlier this year, of course, signed a deal with China, pulling the nation closer to Beijing, triggering concern in Canberra about the influence of China in the region. Then in the past week, the Solomon Islands has not allowed US and UK vessels to enter its ports. Foreign Minister Penny Wong has visited the country and indeed offered to help fund elections in the country. Mr. Sogavare, in response, accused Australia of foreign interference. So, none of that sounds particularly good. But yesterday, Mr. Albanese said he'd host his counterpart next month at the lodge over lunch, adding that he wanted good relations between the two countries. That is good news because we do want good relations with the Solomon Islands. Also yesterday, Adam, Australia and Timor-Leste signed a reciprocal defence cooperation agreement.
Sean, if you think it's getting more expensive to fly around the country, you are right. A competition watchdog report shows a sharp spike in prices over just the past 4 months.
Yeah, the cheapest airfares in August were more than 50% higher than the cheapest airfares in April. 50%. Mind you, April airfares were at an 11-year low. Still, discount airfares in August were at their highest point in 2 years. Business airfares rose by 17% between June and August. Now, there are 3 reasons for the increases. More people wanted to fly, more demand, why not hike the price? There's also been temporary capacity reductions in part due to staffing issues, and jet fuel prices have jumped. Capacity is getting back to more normal levels. In July this year, there were about 4.7 million domestic passengers, which is the highest number since the start of the pandemic, and 89% of the passenger volume of July 2019. Of course, July is school holidays, so it's a big month. Travel to Queensland was particularly strong during the month, presumably reflecting that school holiday factor, while the Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney routes lagged. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission also said that Qantas, Virgin and Rex all increased their market share between April and July 2022 after winning passengers from Jetstar.
Sean, and as we're mentioning planes, it's only fair to mention our colleague Michael. Away at the moment, we wish him well.
We do. I hope he's enjoying Fiji.
Sean, the big banks are big employers, and this week 2 of them are negotiating new enterprise agreements with the finance sector union. National Australia Bank has come in with what seems like a generous offer.
Now, you've run listed companies, Adam,
Yeah.
and I think one of the hardest parts of it are wage negotiations, and that's what's going on in the banking sector at the moment. Now, National Australia Bank is offering staff an extra week of leave and up to a 5% pay rise in the first year for staff earning less than $100,000 and 4.5% in the second year. Staff earning over $100,000 are being offered 4% and 3.5%. This is according to a report in the Financial Review. At Westpac, the offer is 4% and a one-off bonus, which at least in the first year is as generous as National Australia Bank's offer. ANZ and Commonwealth Bank are doing it slightly differently. They tend to negotiate directly with staff, shunning the finance sector union. Now, big companies are finding it hard to get staff, and the offers from the banks are way more generous than we're used to hearing. Whether or not they're generous enough, given inflation is likely to be close to 8% by the end of the year, is still to be seen, though.
On the face of it, Sean, they're good numbers, but you're right. Inflation is not in a typical range.
That's exactly right.
Sean, Japan is one of Australia's largest trading partners, buying plenty of coal and gas, among other things. Tokyo's top diplomat in Australia has warned any reduction in LNG exports to Japan could undermine trust between the two nations.
Ambassador Shingo Yamagami said that Japan's access to Australian coal and gas was a cornerstone of the two countries' partnership and based on mutual trust. Any disruption carried potential risk, he said. Japan is our second largest export partner. We ship close to $20 billion worth of goods each year. Few issues, though. Issue number 1 is the domestic gas security mechanism, which you will hear more about. If it's pulled, producers will be forced to divert gas away from export markets to the local market. Japan would not be happy. And issue number 2 is Japan, like many other producers and buyers of Queensland coal and gas, is upset at the Palaszczuk government's $1.2 billion coal royalty hike announced earlier in the year. The moral of this story is that you really have to look after your customers, and Japan is just making a few noises saying they're not real happy with what's going on.
Sean, scams are costing the economy more than $2 billion a year, and now a consumer group is calling for banks to be liable for losses incurred.
That's right. The Consumer Action Law Centre is arguing that banks would spend more on fighting scammers if they had to refund customers for losses, as they do when credit card fraud occurs. Changing the rules would incentivise the banks to do more, the argument is. The different scams include transaction, investment and romance fraud, and one that often targets older Australians is computer fraud, whereby people are tricked into authorising transfers. It's a very grey area, Adam. While the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has found that scams cost about $2 billion a year, many terms and conditions of agreements between customers and banks say that compensation is invalid when credentials and passwords are shared. That, of course, is exactly what the scammers are trying to have happen. Anyway, we'll hear more on it.
Sean, I'm not sure about you, but I think, emails, texts, or some kind of scam attempt every day.
Oh, absolutely. At the moment, I'm getting 3 to 4 phone calls a day from people who are either scamming me or perhaps they're marketing me. I'm not sure, but it's very frustrating.
Yeah, and all you need is a tiny percentage of them to be successful, and people get really disaffected.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And finally, Sean, wholesaler Metcash said strong sales momentum has continued into the first half of this financial year across supermarkets, liquor and hardware.
Yeah, particularly interesting on the back of those GDP figures, which were for June. Metcash is saying the strength has continued. Now, Metcash, of course, services the majority of IGAs around the country, and Chief Executive Doug Jones said consumers continue to prefer shopping in their local neighbourhoods. Speaking at the group's AGM, Mr. Jones said retailers continue to face an inflationary environment, but that COVID-19 related costs had started to normalise.
Moving on to overseas news, about half of US workers could be described as quiet quitters, according to research by survey firm Gallup, meaning they fulfill their job description but are psychologically detached from their work.
I love this story because I knew exactly what they were talking about when I read it, and I thought, that might be a poor reflection on me.
Only for minutes at a time, I'm sure, Sean.
Sometimes long minutes. Quiet quitters describe a worker's mindset whereby they feel less connected to their organisation's mission, less clarity around what's expected from them, and they see fewer opportunities to learn and grow. Now, according to the Gallup survey in June of over 15,000 full-time and part-time US workers, some 50% met the definition of quiet quitting, while the share of engaged employees was just 32%, and those who were actively disengaged was 18%. This is according to a report in Bloomberg. The quiet quitter phenomenon began in late 2021 in COVID and has spread particularly among Gen Zers and millennials. Now, Gallup says the surge is a symptom of poor management. I think it's also a symptom of the pandemic. Certainly, most of us know exactly what I'm talking about.
So that's nearly 1 in 2 actively disengaged and half meeting that definition of quiet quitting. That's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. Less than a third are actively engaged.
That's a wake-up call. Sean, we talk plenty about electric vehicles, but one car maker that relies on internal combustion engines and is doing very well is Japan's Mitsubishi.
That's right. Mitsubishi Motors Corp shares are up more than 80% this year, better than its Asian peers, thanks to a revival in demand for small cars and utes in Southeast Asia. Add into that the fact that the yen is trading around a 24-year low and Mitsubishi is having a good time of it. Mitsubishi's main markets include Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines, meaning it's just not as vulnerable to a slowdown in the US. That's the key reason it's outperformed Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Subaru and Mazda.
Sean, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Joe Masters from Barrenjoey.
That's right. As I mentioned, we had a great chat about the GDP data out yesterday, about interest rates and what's going to happen there. Joe has a great knack of explaining economics in English, a real skill, well worth a listen.
That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Adam. Well done too.
Thanks. It's Thursday, the 8th of September, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. I'm Adam Lang, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.